Hola, bon vespre a tothom. Moltes gràcies per venir en aquest vespre ventós a la Biennal de Pensament. Moltes gràcies a tothom de l'equip del CCCB per la seva professionalitat i la seva humanitat a l'hora de gestionar aquest acte i gràcies pel privilegi també de poder parlar amb una escriptora que admiro, and thank you, Zadie, for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Tots els humans naixem amb el dret al relat i, tanmateix, la història ens ha ensenyat que no tots els relats han tingut o tenen el mateix valor. El poder, la classe, el gènere i tot condicionant que tingui com a conseqüència la submissió del dèbil al fort condicionen la manera com exercim o ens és privat aquest dret inalienable. Vivim en un temps, a més, en què des de fa anys els grans agents del capitalisme s'han adonat que tenir el control sobre el relat, encara que sigui fals o capciós, és sovint la manera més fàcil d'exercir el control sobre les persones. Un temps, a més, en què internet i les xarxes socials han esdevingut un mitjà perfecte per propagar aquesta mena de relats. El mitjà determina a què atorguem poder i a què no, què convertim en dogma i què menyspreem. En una època en què estem més informats que mai, també és quan som més vulnerables davant d'aquesta informació. Aquest vespre, a propòsit de la publicació de La impostura, que publica Salamandra en castellà amb traducció d'Eugènia Vázquez i que veurà la llum en català el 2025 en la veu de Marta Pera i inaugurarà el catàleg de l'editorial Zadie, tinc el privilegi de parlar sobre la mentida, la impostura i, espero, sobre unes quantes coses més amb algú a qui, si sou aquí, ja ho sabeu, no li cal gaire presentació. Zadie Smith, una de les veus més emblemàtiques i estimades de la literatura britànica, de qui, si només em pogués dir una cosa, en destacaria la mirada sobre el món i la capacitat de traslladar tota la seva curiositat a la ficció, que ha escrit els seus llibres com una temptativa de resposta a unes preguntes concretes sobre el poder, la classe, la desigualtat, l'ambició i la hipocresia, entre d'altres, tots aquests temes que travessen la seva obra. Em podria destacar moltes més coses que mirarem d'anar desgranant durant aquesta conversa, però sempre he pensat que els escriptors que m'agraden, que les persones que m'agraden, comparteixen aquesta qualitat. Davant les preguntes, escriuen per mirar de respondre's a ells mateixos i ajudar els seus lectors a fer-se aquestes mateixes preguntes o a generar-ne de noves. Em fa l'efecte que tant a les seves novel·les com a la seva obra de no ficció i fins i tot molt abans de publicar Dents blanques, la seva primera novel·la, Zadie Smith no ha fet altra cosa i per això avui us diria que no només som davant d'una de les nostres escriptores preferides, sinó sobretot davant d'algú que ha mirat el món de manera crítica, però també tendra i amb un gran sentit de l'humor i ha tingut la generositat de fer literatura de les seves preguntes. Thank you again for being here, Zadie.
Thank you for saying that.
I would like to emphasize this last phrase because Eliza, one of the main characters of your novel, the spark that lights her desire to write something is her obsession about Vogel. And I have always thought that novels also start with this kind of sparks, with a question, with an obsession. And it's not really about writing, about the argument, about the plot, but when you write, you want to answer yourself a question and give the opportunity to others to answer this question as well, or to understand what is happening, or even to generate new questions about a subject. No?
I think for me, part of it is the experience of growing up as a question, which is a strange experience. And I think from the beginning of writing, all I ever wanted to do was demonstrate that even if you consider someone a question within your society or within your life, people themselves are not a question to themselves. I don't walk around thinking, what kind of multicultural experiment am I? I walk around thinking, I am Zadie, I am me. So a lot of the writing has just been trying to express that absolute alterity in everybody's existence. There's a moment in the book which I really like, where Eliza is suddenly talking to two young black people, a Jamaican and an American singer who's come over with the Fisk Choir. It was a gospel choir in the 19th century, traveled throughout Europe, was a big success. And suddenly, just for a moment, she feels like she's the odd one out, or she's the other, or she's odd in some way. And I think that's a healthy feeling that people can have sometimes. And it was enjoyable writing that moment, just the idea of suddenly Eliza being the question. I wanted her to know what it feels like. It's not all bad. Like, in some ways, particularly as a kid, I quite enjoyed being the projection of many people's false ideas, obsessions, concerns. It's very revealing about people. But I guess the point of my fiction is to make the argument that that's their problem. It's not my problem. I was always very clear about who I am. But the projections of other people are, they're ludicrous. They can be oppressive. They can be depressing, and they can also be, kind of funny.
The frauds. It has been labeled as historical fiction. I always like to say that historical fiction, the way we understand it, it cannot be applied to every novel set in the past. And I feel that the fraud is not exactly historical fiction as we tend to think about historical fiction, which is a novel, but is a novel set in the past, which answers questions that are absolutely contemporary. I wanted to ask you, what did you find in the real story of the Thich von Clement trial that connects with our times? Which was the spark for you?
I think the main thing, I lived in America for 15 years, and over time, I began to think there's something odd here. I mean, that's obvious. But one of the things that struck me, it was this feeling that everybody, it's not just America, it's probably global in the West, but that everybody was lying to each other all the time, and also to themselves. And I was trying to think about what that reminded me of, what period in history that reminded me of, where the gap between what people actually felt and what they said was so large. And I thought the Victorians, that's where the gap was that large. So the connection was in my mind from early on. Like, I've been thinking about this book for about 12 years. And then the other connection, which became increasingly obvious, like I was in America when Thomas Piketty published his book Capital, about the gap, the inequality gap in terms of bosses and workers in Europe and America now. And he made the point, which I found so interesting, that the gap has never been larger apart from in the 19th century. So you're dealing with another moment of oligarchs, of billionaires, of power, unregulated business. And that's one way of thinking about slavery in the Caribbean. It's many things, but it's also completely unregulated labor. It's labor unpaid and unregulated. So all those connections started coming to my mind. And finally, the idea that when societies are so radically unequal, it encourages fraud. Because if there's no way of making your way through a society in a basically decent or meritocratic manner, you might as well fake it. And the 19th century is full of frauds. This is just one story, but from Martin Guerre onwards, there's a series of these people pretending to be other people. And then, of course, during the time I was writing this book, there were people like Elizabeth Holmes, Sam Friedman Bank. I mean, there were a series of millennial fraudsters. And it's not that I had sympathy for them, but I recognized the instinct, which is the game is rigged, so might as well cheat.
It makes me think about what Giorgio Agamben says about being contemporary. He describes being contemporary as a singular relationship with one's own time,
Right.
which adheres to it and at the same time keeps a distance from it. Do you think it's necessary to look at the past in order to understand some things in the present?
I mean, if you cut yourself off from the past, um, like in 15 years of talking to students, like I was beginning to get the feeling that they considered the past only a place of iniquity and oppression and ignorance. But of course, that idea, it's basically a neoliberal idea that everything just gets better and better and better over time, and that's how history works. And apart from that being impossible, because they were stating two things simultaneously. One, things get better and better, and simultaneously, we're living in a trash fire world. So I was fascinated by this contradiction. How can both things be true? How can progress just be an endless arrow into the future, and yet we're not living in utopia? So that was the first thing. But also, if you cut yourself off from the past, you cut yourself off from examples of activism that you might find useful. So even just for my own benefit, one of the points of writing this book was, how do you end enormous systems of capital in which millions of people are profiting? How do you end something like that? And the 19th century gives you some answers. It's a complicated answer, and it involves a great many people, from heroes like Frederick Douglass to women boycotting sugar like Eliza Touchet, to mass movements of workers on the streets of London, to the slaves themselves revolting. But it's a lesson. But if you consider the past just this dead place where people were boring and never had sex and had no ideas and weren't as great as you never learn. It's like a just system of ignorance that just piles on top of itself. So partly it was just for myself. I wanted to know how change happens, how it actually happens. And reading about the 19th century is a good way to find that out.
The novel has a lot of characters, of course, but the two main characters, Eliza Touchet and Bogle, the Jamaican slave who acts as the main witness in the Tichborne trial, although they complement each other, I get the sense that each, with their voice, ends up telling a life story,
Right.
not only the story of the trial or the people who was around the trial, but her own story, which is a story of two different oppressions,
Right.
and how to get something of the life you've been dealt. In terms of dignity, they want to preserve their dignity in a way. We know a lot of things about them, about their thoughts mainly. They don't speak a lot, or maybe Eliza sometimes when he's in these reunions with men and everything. But they have a very strong sense of dignity.
I think that's another part of the 19th century, is that there are a series of liberation movements happening simultaneously. And what's interesting about someone like Eliza is, first, she's a committed Catholic, so she's existing in two realities. In one reality, in God's world, there is something called absolute justice, in which people are born free, are radically equal, and that is complete. And then there's something called history, in which liberation takes time and is not instantaneous and has all kinds of blocks in its way. So that interested me, writing a character who exists in those two realities. She knows that there's no such thing as a slave. And at the same time, in the 19th century, people are enslaved. Those two things are happening simultaneously. So there's an argument at the end of the book between her and a young radical called Henry, mixed race boy, who's a real person. Everybody's a real person. And she's making the argument of gradualism, of the politics of the world, which is, if we want things to change, we need to sign these petitions, we need to go to Parliament, we need to act together. And Henry's argument is, you don't have the right to free me. Who are you to free me? I am free. All human beings are free. So it's interesting writing that argument, because I was more like I was just watching it happen. I was just kind of curious, how's this going to end up? Because they're both right, of course. There's no way in which a person can be owned, and yet in history people have been owned. So those two realities, which happen simultaneously, are impossible to make peace with. Henry's absolutely right. The only just thing is freedom now, freedom for everyone, freedom in this moment. And Eliza is also right. History is a process, it happens in time. And the awful and tragic thing about that is during that process, people live and die. People live and die without any of the privileges I take for granted.
It's also very interesting how at the end of the book, I don't want to make any spoilers, but the title of the book is a reference to Vogel boss.
Yeah.
And Eliza is trying to find a pseudonym to sign the book, no? So in the end, no, these two characters, they are subsided again to a higher reality, no?
I mean, I think all the way through the book, Eliza is basically writing the book, The Fraud. And that's a kind of, something I love about fiction is that it's not like what I'm doing now, which is just speaking to you directly in my first person voice. And it's not like political speech, and it's not like a lawyer's argument, it's not like a contract. It's a weird, multivalent thing where many things can be true simultaneously. So there's a moment where she sits down and Bogle tells her his entire life story, from the moment his father was taken from Africa to his entire life on a plantation. It's of course not possible that he could sit down and tell her that story in its entirety, but in fiction, all things are possible.
Yeah.
And I also wanted to depict, I don't know, what you would call the uses of voyeurism. Eliza Touche is a voyeur for sure. She has a kind of inappropriate curiosity about the life of this black man, and she wants to know, and she thinks she can know, and she's even willing to write about it. And for me, the book is a celebration of that kind of voyeurism, because I do believe interest in people's lives is the beginning of a political action, but there's also a limit to it. And I guess what I found funny in the book is that Eliza so wants Bogle to love her. she wants to be friends.
Yeah.
And Bogle doesn't want to be friends. He just wants freedom. So it's an interesting example of solidarity. Like Eliza thinks in order to be in solidarity with someone, you have to love them and know them entirely and write an entire novel about their lives and all the rest of it. But in fact, it takes much less than that. You just need to support the cause, maybe march in the street, maybe sign a petition. No one needs to love each other. Love is nice, it's great when it happens, but it's not a necessity of political action. So I think that's something Eliza learns over time.
I must admit that when I started reading The Fraud, I thought that the fraud itself would only be the claimant.
Right.
But when I kept reading, I was like, no, everyone here is a walking contradiction in his own way. And I love the way you celebrate contradiction in your book as a part, an inner part of human condition. No, because every character, I mean, they're not bad people. Eliza is a good person. William is a good person. Everyone's fine, with some exceptions. But they have a lot of contradictions with the things they are defending, or the things they believe in, and the way they act, or they come where they come from.
There's a phrase in English, which I don't know if you have in Spanish, which is, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. To me, that's a very important principle, personally, philosophically, politically. It's wonderful that there are people close to perfection, that there are saints and heroes. But history can't just be left to saints and heroes. And you have to leave open the possibility of participation of all kinds of assholes who can also help. And the analogy in my mind was the climate crisis. It might not seem like an analogy, but I thought, here's another global system of capital in which millions and millions of people profit, and which most of us at this point are aware of, just as in 1830, most people in England were by then aware of what was going on in Jamaica. So the choices before us are, there's perfect action. Like I always, since I've been on book tour these past few weeks, I always like to mention that my colleague and friend Sally Rooney is not on book tour because she doesn't fly, because she doesn't believe in flying because of the climate. Now there's an example of a genuine sacrifice. So there are people like Zadie Rooney, and then there are people like us, I presume, who went on holiday this year somewhere, got on a plane. Then there are kids who lie in front of planes and refuse to let them fly, or throw paint at paintings, or sacrifice their own careers or university careers to do these kind of things. And then there's all of us who could do something like, not buy a plastic bottle. So there are these incredible degrees of action. But I feel like if you say to people, either do the perfect action or do nothing, all that you breed is nihilism and despair. Whereas if you say to somebody, how about not buying that plastic bottle today or ever again, you give them a possibility of action. Mm-hmm. So that's what it's about. It's not about not understanding the difference between Sally not coming here and me coming here. There is certainly an ethical difference. But the point is, you have to give people space in which to act to their capacities. Mm-hmm. And people at different points in their life have different capacities. A young person without children has got time and space to go and throw paint at the Mona Lisa, and God bless those people. But the mother with 3 children at home cannot do that. She might have to do some other action. So if you allow people the space to act without judging them on their limitations, some of them which are just contingencies, you might find it more possible to create mass actions.
Mm-hmm. And also, I think we live in a society that wants like solid rock identities. They don't allow change. We are not. You have to be this and that and that and that. Right. And if at some point in your life you do another thing, right. It's like society doesn't really understand why have you changed, but I think change is a part of life.
Yeah, I mean, if you present yourself as a public, something for public consumption, which oddly is something that citizens are doing every day, not just people sitting on stages, but everybody, then that argument of consistency becomes a problem, absolutely. But private people allowed their private inconsistencies. And I definitely prefer to be a private person in that sense. But I don't know, I was born into a different system. So for me, every day of my childhood, I could be mistaken for Black, Moroccan, Spanish, whatever, 1,000 things a day. I know who I am. So you have to, those kind of experiences in childhood teach you the difference between the importance of the opinions of others and your sense of your own self. If I had to believe in the opinions of others, I would not be my mother's child or my father's child or my brother's sister, So that kind of reliance on appearance as a marker of identity is alien to me, because I learned a long time ago that it's meaningless.
Mm-hmm. That reminds me of that line in NY, I think, in which Leah is listening to a song in the radio, and there's this quote: "I am the sole author of the dictionary that the dictionary that defines me," and she tries to write it down, but the pencil is not marking the magazine where she tries to write it.
I have a weird relation with that line, because I wrote it as a, as the nightmare, because we are also communal animals.
Yes.
Like I know people can have all kinds of thoughts about me, and I can have a thought about myself, but I can't also choose to claim I am a certain way and then force people to submit to my vision. I can't say, I'm just a very kind person. It's just the kind of person I am. No. My kindness will be judged by how I behave in the world. That's for other people to judge.
But strangely, this quote is now said as something, no? But I have always thought about it as the impossibility.
It's impossible.
And
also, it's like it's a pure dream of
Yeah.
capital that you can just brand yourself and then force
Yeah.
everybody to submit to what you have described. That's not it. When I think of myself as being, mistaken over and over as a child, of course it's annoying, but it's not, it's also fine. And also it can be strangely liberating. If I got into a taxi and someone thought I was Egyptian, for a moment I'm in the world of Egypt. I get to be, for a second, mistaken part of this extraordinary community. I can listen to the cab driver. He tells me, at some point I have to say, I'm sorry, actually I'm not Egyptian. Jamaica is my home. But that form of identity, for me, it's a negotiation. There's what you know about yourself, what you believe about yourself, but you're also a social animal. And other people will decide if you're kind, interesting, funny, sweet. You cannot determine that yourself. That's not something that is essential to you. That's an act of relation with others.
But this leveling, for example, I have always found that it is dangerous, especially for people in art, but especially for women in art. You have to suffer this yourself as this, Zadie Smith is the voice of a generation. But nowadays, we see it constantly. Every time a women writer writes a novel that connects with the audience or wherever,
Right.
she's the new whoever, or she's the new voice of the generation. And I think it's very dangerous because we end up being potential objects of consumption, not
Women are
artists or writers. no?
determined as objects
Yeah.
in the world. We're just over-determined. There's just an enormous amount of language, idea, myth, story that surrounds us. And when de Beauvoir said that thing about women are not born but made, that's what she meant. She said, this is 5,000 years of the collection of metaphor around us.
Yeah.
It will take another 5,000 years if we get that far to get it all off us. But you begin to see it. You begin to see women appearing in the world as they actually are. And that's a revolution. But the thing about, the girl novelist, I think if you're smart, and Sally is a very good example, you go back to your desk and you write your books and you ignore it. She's very good at that.
Yeah. Let's talk about the writing process for a bit. The novel is written in very short chapters.
Yes.
And divided into 8 books, like Middlemarch. But I have read that the writing process was also kind of special with these short chapters. I want to tell the audience about that because it's interesting.
Yeah, it was a mixture of things. One, I love this dog. I wish it would come on stage. One was about, I guess, modernity, about the idea of attention. I wanted to make it like almost bite-sized, that you'd be putting a Victorian novel together in this deconstructed way, because the things that Victorian novels often hid, many Victorian novels and many of, oh wow. I'm going to let it play.
8.
8, there'll be 8,
Yeah.
yes. Go on. I've lost count.
I won't need anyone to tell me stop because
In Trollope's novels and Dickens' novels, often you'll have a dissolute uncle going to Jamaica because he can't find him a job anywhere else. And so the novels they're full of this kind of repressed knowledge. Toni Morrison wrote a wonderful series of essays about American 19th century literature and this repressed knowledge. It's always there. You can't hide it. What we're dealing with now is the return of the repressed. It suddenly burst into the open globally. But I wanted to make this Victorian novel in pieces, so you put it together yourself, out of respect for the reader and for the game of it, I guess. But there's other principles too. One is that I have 2 small children, and keeping a novel in your mind is not easy. It's a kind of young person's game. It gets harder as you get older, and it's not an accident that particularly people who write novels in their 70s, 80s, if they carry on that long, the novels get shorter, not because people don't have ideas, but because the act of keeping a novel in your mind becomes a struggle. And these short sections were so amenable to my life, which is writing between school drop-off and school pickup, writing when someone's playing football, writing during a music class, writing on the bus, writing on the train. It was a way of breaking the task into something manageable.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, I had these two friends, Daryl Pinkney, who's a wonderful African-American scholar and writer in New York, and my friend Devorah Baum, who is a philosopher and writer in London. And they were both interested in the project, and I had made a deal with them that I would write it in serial, just like the Victorians. So I would just write it from the beginning to the end, sending them sections every 2 weeks and just plowing forward.
In a very Victorian way.
Yeah,
as well.
because I wanted to see if I could do it, because that's how all novels were written until really very recently in the history of the novel. And not only that, both Dickens and William Ainsworth, who's a character in the novel, more than once wrote 2 novels simultaneously. That means writing 2 chapters of 2 different novels once every 2 weeks and sending them to 2 different journals. And in the end, you have 2 novels in 1 year. This is writing. I mean, that is absolutely extraordinary. And we're capable of it. We're actually capable of this kind of thing. We haven't lost the capability to do this stuff. So I just tried to do it that way, like knowing that they were waiting for it every 2 weeks, it would go straight to their inbox, and the novel was constructed that way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if it happened to you as a writer, but it happened to me as a reader, that the chapters where Eliza was the focus of the plot, and the ones in which Bogle was the focus, they have very different tones.
Yeah,
I could feel that I was sadder when I was reading Bogle's story because of the tone, and then maybe because Eliza's life in society was filled with humor and these kind of situations, but the parts in which Bogle has the focus are very.
They're in a different situation. Eliza is oppressed, you would say, but she's also an observer of life. Bogle's in a different category. Simone Weil describes he is the afflicted. To be afflicted is a completely different thing.
Yeah.
It's not a microaggression. It's not an oppression. To be afflicted is to be someone to whom anything can be done. That's a very different situation.
And did you work on the tone on purpose, or did it?
I just knew that he's from reading.
Naturally.
There's not many first-person accounts of the enslaved from the Caribbean, but there are a few, and what there are I read. And what you notice about them is that they're not written the way I think you would expect or would want them to be written. They're not these kind of furious descriptions of horror, because when you're that afflicted, you don't have a position outside of it. Mm-hmm. There's no shock or horror at their circumstance. It's just a description. It's straight. Mm-hmm. Sometimes acts of particular cruelty are noted, but I wanted to write in that way what it's actually like to become habituated to a level of affliction. Mm-hmm. When you're afflicted, you're not in a constant state of shock every moment of the day that you're afflicted. If you read Primo Levi, if you read Solzhenitsyn, you'll see it again. When people are genuinely afflicted, when they're in concentration camps, when they're in plantations, when they're in lagers, they don't speak the way the person who's been slightly offended by someone being slightly racist to them in the street. They don't speak that way. Mm-hmm. There's no heavy rhetoric. There's no great speeches. It's a different state of mind. Mm-hmm. It's hard to understand if you've never been afflicted, but I wanted to write from that point of view. There's no need for exclamation marks or, I don't know, whatever else people do when they write these narratives, mm-hmm. or poetry or fancy rhetoric or italics. Mm-hmm. People are enslaved.
Yeah.
All you have to do is write the facts.
Yeah. That's something that you point out in the novel, in a chapter where Eliza is reading William's novel about slavery, about Jamaica, and it's cheesy. There's a
Yeah.
landscape, and it made me think about how narratives of slavery or colonies have got to us because they're not written by the people really living that, but
Yeah.
it's a kind of romanticized thing.
It's romanticized. There's no narrative and in affliction. It just is this pain. And again, Primo Levi was one of the inspirations. Reading him, his tone. You know, when he was writing, I think people expected this poetic cry from the concentration camps. He did not write in that way. He wanted to write the facts because the facts were sufficient. And I agree.
I have always thought, maybe I'm wrong, but I have always thought that the liar is often someone who feels a strange kind of confidence, a sort of disdain for the intelligence of others, which makes them believe that their lie, their imposture, will be successful. But in our times, falsehoods gain more traction than we might imagine. We see constantly in politics with the rise of racism, the far right, and talk shows, and among self-help gurus or influencers, no? And I think that this disdain for intelligence is kind of expanding when it comes to these narratives, no, or these frauds. We are surrounded by frauds who speak loud, no?
Yeah, but I understand it. If I was 20 looking at the absolute despoilation of the earth, the absolute inequality of economic relations, I would then assume that everything leading up to this point was a crime. That makes complete sense to me. But I guess the exercise is, like, even now, when I was coming on the plane to Barcelona, there was some kids behind me talking about university. They were American and British, but all South Asian by ancestry. And they were talking about, I think, Sweden. They were saying, you know, it's so incredible. You can go to Sweden to university for free. If I went, it would still be free. You don't even have to be Swedish. Isn't it extraordinary? You could just turn up. It's not anything like that in the world. There never has been. And I was like, the historical memory disappears so quickly. So I like an old lady, I turned around and said, I went to university for free 25 years ago. I went to school for free. My healthcare was free. These things happened. They're not like fairy tales from a different universe. They existed in Europe really recently. And they all looked at me like, what? And I was like, it's horrifying, that part. The idea that the tiny bits of progress we had made are being eliminated, not just practically, but in memory, as if they never occurred. So I really do feel myself in the role of the ancient mariner, not to say, oh, hey guys, it was so great in 1984 or whatever, but to point out that more just arrangements have existed. They were not perfect, but they did exist. And what was wrong with them could be improved. But to imagine that they never existed at all is to allow victory to a completely other strain of understanding about our lives. It's to allow the right to claim that nothing like that could ever work, has ever worked, and will never work. And that's not true.
Mm-hmm. But it makes me think about another idea I think you present in the book about when the Clairman comes back, her mother, the false Clairman, comes back. Her mother doesn't mind about him being fat. He doesn't speaking French and everything. And it made me think that sometimes frauds or lies survive because of the desire of others, no? Because it's more comfortable to live in the fraud than to face reality.
People are capable of telling themselves absolutely anything. I include myself in that. And many of our most, closely held beliefs and loves and institutions are absolute acts of faith and self-delusion. Marriage is number one. We get married. So these things, delusion is natural to human beings. And so, sometimes I hear particularly right-wing philosophers making the argument that it was my generation and deconstruction and post-structuralism and relativism which has created this crisis of truth. But I never felt that way. I feel like the philosophy I grew up in, particularly deconstruction, is about livable truths. It's about truths that make people's lives just and fair. They don't have to have an essential and transcendent absolute truth. They need to be just. They need to be livable. And I don't call that relativism. I just think that's truth directed at human life. So, yes, people are easily deluded. People are very easily modified. People are very easily influenced. But then the question becomes, who do you want to be influenced by? And I make my choices. I would rather be influenced by the novelists, philosophers that I care about and the people in my actual real life than a group of billionaire capitalists in Palo Alto. That's my choice. And I have a belief that soon many, many people are going to make similar choices, a similar rejection of being told what to think, when to think, and how to think it.
We were talking before about identity or how we are labeled by others, and this has been a constant subject in your works. But in the fraud, it is presented, I think, in a very strong way, framed within the moral of the Victorian society, and also operating at different levels of hierarchy, which interests me a lot because Eliza, at some point, disdains Sarah because she's not as clever as she is, but and at the same time, William disdains Eliza. And you were talking about delusion, and I was thinking maybe the will to shape a firm identity and to believe that your identity is the right one is also a delusion, no?
I think
this is what
it's
generates
just about
this.
moving away from an essentialism. Like that, there's a scene where Eliza, who's always thought of herself as poor, and she is poor, goes walking with Sarah to a neighborhood in London, Wapping, and realizes for the first time, oh, I'm not that poor. And that's an experience I had many times in childhood. I would think I was poor, and then I'd go around to a friend's flat, and I'd be like, oh, right. No, I'm not that poor. I'm poor, but I'm not that poor. So that involves some kind of flexibility of thought. If I had it in my head, I am poor. That is my idea. I am, and that certain things accrue to me, and that is my issue. And these reality checks happen all the time. I could go to the flat of my friend and think, oh no, I'm not poor. I'm lower middle class. Or I could go to Jamaica to my mother's family and realize there was a whole other possibility of poverty that hadn't even occurred to me. So, to me, it's not having an identity. I know I have one, but I'm aware that it's structural. That there are positions in which I have power and positions in which I don't. I'm not working class anymore. My life has transformed. You have to be able to be movable in these ideas. Sometimes it's funny, like, I'm a black woman, but when I went to the Gambia, I wasn't black to them. As far as they were concerned, I was white, English, or something else strange, definitely not black. So, sometimes I guess I could consider that a terrible wound. I went back to Africa and they thought I was white. But it's funny, in the end. It's just one of those things. So it's about having a kind of identity that, of course, knows itself, but is willing to deal with the fact that there are many realities in this world in which your role will transform depending on where you are and at what moment.
There's a hilarious article you wrote for the New Yorker about Charles Dickens. I had a lot of fun reading it because you wanted to avoid Dickens in your novel, but Dickens kept on showing up in different ways, even when you finish the novel. And you decided to include him finally because he was everywhere, and you even kill him in the novel.
Right. Yeah, he pops up again though. He's such an impressive person. He talk about coming from nothing. I mean, he really came from nothing, and he also experienced the courts in the way that Tichborne experiences them, in that Dickens' father was jailed for being poor. Another example of the incredible reforms of the late Victorian period, that stopped being a thing. Up until the 1850s, you could go to jail for being poor, debtor's prison. That's where Dickens' father ended up for years. So Dickens is an amazing person. He's completely self-created, an autodidact, not properly schooled, who ended up changing the English legal system, changing the copyright system, basically creating it. There's so much that he achieved that I admire. And then there are these spectacular failings, like having literally no interest in what was happening in Jamaica, and in fact supporting a massacre there. So he's an example to me of a kind of sentimental politics. So whenever he walked through the streets of London, he would see injustice and he would rush home to his house and then write about it very effectively and very powerfully. But he had not been to Jamaica. When he went to America on book tour, he went below the Mason and Dixon line for the first time and saw American slavery. And from that point on, refused to read there ever again. So there's an example. To me, you judge it how you judge it. Here's a man who had to see something to act upon it. I don't think that's that rare. I think there are a lot of us like that, right?
Yeah.
Not really agitated by something unless we see a photograph of a dying person in the paper or the boat overturned on the Italian beach. Spectacle as a thing for charging politics, it happens. So I don't mean to condemn Dickens in the book. I'm just saying he's that kind of guy.
I don't feel that you condemn Dickens in the book.
He's that kind of guy.
No,
sometimes he was active, sometimes he wasn't.
Yeah.
He was an extraordinary writer, incredible energy, but he had his limitations. It's not a disaster to have limitations.
Even his dad is pictured as something practical at some point, because Ainsworth will sell. He's selling, in fact, and he outsold Oliver Twist.
Yeah, they're both, to me, impressive, but in different ways. Like, William is a terrible writer, for sure, but a kind man, a generous man, a non-jealous man, which is very rare in men. So he has his own virtues,
There's another subject that I find it very interesting. When you depict Eliza's lifetime, and you bring to light the issue of, or Eliza brings to light the issue of female aging, and it is something that you've written about in your previous work, and there was something about it in Swing Times, but especially in Beauty. There's a moment in which Sora says, she thinks I'm no longer decorative. And I feel that very often, we were talking about levels before, the ultimate leveling for a woman, as Eliza puts it, is total exclusion. She was half excluded for some reasons before, but when she ages, when the change comes, he's totally excluded.
I mean, it's hard. Like, it's not easy. It's horrible losing beauty. It's horrible losing youth. I don't think it's only horrible. I'm trying to think about it myself, write through it myself. I can't help but notice everywhere I go, groups of women in their 70s laughing their heads off together. And you always think, what are you so happy about? And I want to find out. It looks like there's something fun on the other side. And it might exactly be freedom from all of this sense of being an object in the world, or being an object to others. But it's something Eliza says, it's in the Bible, to everything there is a season. Like, I really appreciate walking down the street and seeing beautiful young people decorating the world. Like it's a pleasure to see that. It's a pleasure. I'm glad that they're there. I like seeing them. It makes my day better. Once we were all one of them, and then we won't be, and we'll have to find some other way of moving through the world. And it's not easy, but I don't think it has to be the tragedy that it's depicted as, or I don't know. I mean, there's no choice anyway.
We have to finish.
Yes.
Now it has. At the end of the preface of Intimations, you say something very beautiful and very interesting that connects both to the fraud and to current populism and struggles. Millions of more or less amorphous selves will not necessarily find themselves solidifying into protesters, activists, marchers, voters, vibrant impeachers, lobbyists, soldiers, champions, defenders, historians, etc. You can fight fire with air, but equally you can fight for a freedom you've forgotten how to identify. My last question would be the failure to recognize this freedom combined with the extreme individualism of our times makes us truly unaware of what is happening in the world. No? 7,000 people are killed every year in Nigeria. There were
Sudan.
in Sudan, yesterday in
Lebanon.
Gaza, people were being burned alive in tents. The population has no
Yeah.
access to water, food, or electricity, and everything under the fallacy, once again, a fraud of protection or revenge, but in reality is a revenge against 1.5 million people trapped in a small strip of land about a quarter the size of London. And sometimes I feel that seeing it live or trying to identify what is freedom for every one of us we can't reconcile our daily life with the suffering of others.
But this is a central question which I really don't know the answer to. Like, when I was growing up, I thought the purpose of political action is to create settlements in which people have the time and space to live their intimate lives. That's the point. That you create structures that are just enough that people can fall in love, that people can have their children, that they can go to clubs and dance all night, that politics can be left aside because a settlement has been made which is decent enough to live in. That was, I think, the belief of my generation, that such a settlement was possible and would last. But the alternate argument is, the moment you step away from the barricades, horror. So then it's a different vision of human life, that there is no pause from the barricades, that there is never a just settlement, and you have to be at the barricades all the time, and that there is no time for intimate life, no time for personal existence. I don't know the answer to that. Obviously, I have always hoped that it's possible to make political structures that last. A very small and stupid example, but struck me recently when I was walking through London as I passed what we call a Peabody estate, which were, again, creation of the Victorians. It's a beautiful 19th century apartment block, and it has balconies on each end, and a little sign which says, this is for the workers of Soho. It was built for them. It was absolute reduced rent, and there's a little balcony so they can have their gardens. And this building, almost 200 years later, still stands, still creates apartments for working people. They still have gardens. The flowers are still in their boxes. And to me, this is the ideal, that you have societies that think far enough ahead that they can create structures that last as long as possible. For that, you need law. These things have to be written into law. Every park in England is the same. That's land that's been stolen from private owners for public consumption and then legally enshrined so it stays public. Those kind of acts, they might seem small, but that makes life possible. So that is always my dream, but I absolutely understand the argument of many people that the moment you sit in that apartment and grow your flowers and take your foot off the pedal, it roars back. So I don't know, I don't have any answer for you, but those two ideas are always in my mind.
We have 5 minutes for some questions from the audience. If there's...
Hello.
Hey.
Hi. Big fan. I'm interested in what you said about taking your foot off the pedal, because something that struck me in, oh my goodness, your book of essays, But Not Feel Free. My goodness.
Intimations?
Intimations.
Right.
Oh gosh. Your time spent in the US and how sort of disillusionment with how the US handled COVID, how Black Lives Matter was fighting and was being sort of pushed back. You reached a point at the end of that essay where you talked about that maybe this was a turning point for you where you couldn't look back anymore, where this would be a moment where, despite your, in the past, maybe being more timid, this would not be a point where you could keep quiet as a writer anymore. I'm butchering your argument, but I'm wondering, we're a few years from that, and I know a lot of the world has forgotten what life was like in COVID, because in ways things get worse. I'm wondering, just where have you gone from there in your thought? Maybe not in your actions, but where do you think? Where do you stand on that?
You know, for me, moving back to England was moving back to a country which, at least at the local level where I live, still retains the idea of solidarity between peoples. What I felt in America, there's some brilliant pieces being written about this at the moment, actually, and a whole book about it by Matthew Desmond, that the deliberate fracturing of the black and white working class in America is deliberate. And the only people it benefits are the ruling class. And I did not grow up like that. I grew up in a working class community in which South Asians, blacks, the Irish, Jews work together for working class causes. And I don't know how that's possible in America. I don't know how to, I didn't see evidence of it. I didn't know how to, it seemed to be a society so fractured that possibility wasn't there. Whereas in the neighborhood I live in, that is still a possibility. So I returned to somewhere with the politics that I understand and that I cherish. So I send all my support and hope for my American brothers and sisters, but I don't know how to function in that society in which solidarity isn't even a concept. There's only individualism and there's only capital.
Thank you.
No sé si tenim temps per alguna pregunta més. Una més? Sí. Qui serà l'afortunat? L'afortunada? It's kind of a lottery. We have just time for one question.
Thank you for being with us tonight. I would like to know if the word bogle in your latest book, Fraud, has something to do with the Scottish meaning of scarecrow or something frightening?
Yeah. I mean, Bogle's got this incredible history as a name. In Jamaica, it's famous because of Paul Bogle, who was a revolutionary, a labor hero. Hey, dogs. And Bogle has followed me through. There's a Bogle in NW as well. And the Scottish meaning of scarecrow, absolutely. These bells have it in for me.
Thank you.
The idea of a bogle as it also actually weirdly is a kind of dance in ragga music as well. It's got many meanings. But the idea of a bogle as an object of fear, that was what's so interesting, that when he stood up in that courtroom in England, he was immediately beloved. He became this kind of folk hero. And that interested me too, that the figure of the black man at that moment, which could easily have been a kind of bogeyman, a scarecrow, was seen by the working people of England as an ally, as someone working in the same system they were working in, though in a much more extreme degree. So yeah, I'm very fond of bogles generally. Yeah.
Thank you, very interesting.
Ara sí que ja està. Doncs bé, fins aquí. Moltíssimes gràcies per haver vingut. Moltíssimes gràcies de nou a tothom del CCCB. Thank you, Zadie Smith.
Thank you.
I ara, aquí al costat, la Zadie, per qui ho vulgui, signarà els seus llibres, que acabeu de passar un bon dia. Moltes gràcies.
Thank you.